Hi there, and welcome to the second bonus episode of Two Texts, where I am talking to John Andrews about his new book, Second Chance. If you've not listened to the last episode, then I recommend you go listen to that first as we jump into part 2 today, exploring some of the ideas that John talks about in his new book about John Mark. So, John, we are back talking about John Mark, who is a character who is immersed in stories of second chances. Mark messes up some things, causes a bit of a problem between him and Paul and Barnabas. Mark seems to potentially allude to some trouble he got in during Jesus' life in his gospel. Mark writes a gospel with one of his major sources being Peter, who is full of second chances. We find Mark in the book of Acts alongside Paul, who kind of has made a bit of a mess of life and becomes God's great missionary. So it's like, at some level, your book's called Second Chance and it's about Mark. It could be about any of these characters, couldn't it?
Completely. And I think that's why, for me, John Mark, his story isn't just about his story. I think his story intertwines with Barnabas, it intertwines with Peter, it intertwines with Paul, it intertwines with the Christian community and their response to him when Paul urges them to listen to the instructions he's written about him and welcome him. And I think it is also our story. All of us have been, to some extent or another, in a John Mark moment where we have stumbled, fallen, let ourselves down, maybe let others down. Or we have been the other side of that, where we have had to deal with someone who has stumbled and fallen, let themselves down and let us down. And therefore, his story becomes a microcosm, not only of the gospel, but of the hope of redemption, repurposing, and reclaiming. It's funny, where I live, David, we're very blessed in the home we live in. We live in a farming community, a farming village, very small village. And the home that Dawn and I live in now was built by a guy 20 years ago as his forever home. And people often look at our home and say, it's so pretty on the outside. And when they say that, I often smile, a sort of a John Mark smile, because our home is dressed with what's called reclaimed brick.
Right. Okay.
So essentially, the outside of our home, which people have on more than one occasion said, how pretty your house looks, is essentially dressed by bricks that were discarded. So these bricks have been discarded, cleaned, reused. And if you look at our home, literally some of the bricks are misshapen. They are discolored. They look odd as individual bricks. But when you step back, David, and look at the house as a whole, it sort of works. And this is the story of John Mark. If we zero in on one person, then it can often look like a misshapen, ill-fitting brick. But when we see someone's journey, as we're urged to see it in the context of the biblical text, in the context of a loving, reinforcing community, a community of other misshaped bricks that are built together into a living house to the Lord, then John Mark's story becomes even more dynamic. So the story of Second Chance is really not just about John Mark. It's about Barnabas, Peter, Paul. It's about all the people they represent, and also it's about the community into which this is framed and placed. And that's why I think it's an important message for us.
No, I love that, John. I love that, and now all of our Two Text community are wanting to come drive past your house just to see what it looks like.
They may not think it's pretty, but we've been blessed by how often people say, "Oh, your house looks lovely," and I often laugh. I think it's so funny. They're actually complimenting disused bricks that have been reclaimed. And I just think that's a motif of the gospel. And with my own journey, I look at the home in which I live, and I do sort of see the Lord's wonderful sense of humor in placing us in a home dressed by reclaimed bricks in the context of our own journey, which to some extent, has experienced his reclaiming love. So yeah, it's amazing.
Beauty from ashes, I think.
Come on.
It says in the Old Testament, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So with that theme in mind then, of things being reclaimed, last episode we talked about almost really where we meet John Mark. I mean, it's not, we talked about the Acts 15 story, it's not exactly where we meet him, but it's where we realize, oh, wait a minute, this guy's quite significant. There's a story happening here. You talk about this thread of John Mark references through Scripture, but we really kind of get to know him in this fight between Barnabas and Paul, and Paul saying, I'm not working with that guy because he abandons us. And that's really interesting because we follow this trend through and we find something at the other end of the story, don't we?
Indeed, we do. We do. If you follow the golden thread, then we eventually reach what some people would regard, many people would regard as the last recorded words of Paul, 2 Timothy and 2 Timothy chapter 4. And we enter a climactic passage in this letter, which is, I find, profoundly moving. You've got this old war horse of an apostle who has worked tirelessly for the gospel. The love of Christ has compelled him. He has taken the gospel to 4 provinces of the Roman Empire and built on no man's foundation. I mean, this is a serious player. He has run his race. He has fought his fight. He has finished his course. I mean, this is his language. And tucked in the middle of one of his most vulnerable and personal and intimate discourses in his letter, we get a beautifully climactic redemptive statement about Mark, and I think it's a beautiful place to sort of reflect on as part of our 2-text conversation.
Yeah. Well, can I read a section then from 2 Timothy?
Please,
and this will sort of put it into place. I'm going to read from verse 6, actually, just to, because there's so many beautiful words. So this is Paul writing a personal letter to the young Timothy. Verse 6 of 2 Timothy chapter 4. As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful in my ministry. I have sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will pay him back for his deeds. But you also must beware of him, for he strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen.
That is magnificent, isn't it?
What a text. And I wanted to read the whole text, John, because I think it's really interesting. There's just this one, thunderclap of a mention of Mark in the middle of it. But it's interesting to notice how the whole framing of Paul's faithfulness to the gospel, but the story is of people who are deserting him. Indeed. And I feel like the acute reader reads this list of people who are abandoning Paul or for other valid reasons are unable to be with him. And who does he call for in the midst of all of this desertion? But John Mark.
Absolutely. it's. I mean, as you read, I'm filled up with emotion again. I'm struggling to talk. Yeah, if you have been following the golden thread of this story, then this statement, and especially where it is positioned in the context of desertion or abandonment language, you cannot help but see that Paul is doing something quite profound here, and there are explicit and implicit messages being communicated through what Paul is saying here. And I even the vulnerability at the end of this passage, which is just the last couple of verses, which says, "Do your best to get here before winter." I find I'm really moved by Paul's vulnerability, by his sense of people he trusted and leaned on are now not there for whatever reason. And of all the people Paul could have asked for, he asks for the man who maybe 10 to 14 years before deserted him.
Yeah.
And I go, now that is powerful. That's a powerful statement. And not only does he ask for him, but his language is so affirmative. Bring him with you. He is useful or helpful to me in my ministry. And there's a beautiful allusion in Philemon when Paul writes to Philemon, interestingly on behalf of Onesimus. And what's really striking is if you read Philemon, which is Paul's private letter to his friend Philemon, who lives at Colossae, Paul sounds like Barnabas probably would have sounded on behalf of John Mark when he defends John Mark all those years before. Paul is doing a Barney. He's defending Onesimus. And in Philemon, Paul refers to Mark as one of his synergoi, his fellow workers. Yeah. So something so dramatically has changed that Mark is now a fellow worker with Paul and useful to him in his ministry. And there's not only the subtext of desertion and abandonment there, but also back in Acts 15, when Paul is arguing with Barnabas about not taking John Mark, there is an implication in the language that Paul infers that Mark is unfit. So if you read that text carefully, the implication is he's implying an unfitness of John Mark to go.
Yes.
Some of the translations are very kind. And here he uses the language of useful. So you get you get the symmetry of desertion, but bring Mark to be with me. There's a turning over of that. And then there's the unfit and useful. And this is, I think this is Paul. Can I say this carefully? I think this is Paul. This is Paul affirming that he's also had a second chance. That he maybe tips his hat to Barnabas and goes, Barney got this right. When it came to John Mark, Barnabas did it right, and he got it right. And Mark as now stands as one of the most useful and dynamic people in my world. So there is a beautiful redemptive completion here. It's like it comes full circle in the story.
Like I was just looking at the Greek text of 2 Timothy 4:11 here. And again, translations often have wonderful nuances to them or subtleties or even just space in them that a translator moving to a new language can't leave or that would be confusing. But the Greek literally here, for he is to me useful. And then the Greek is eis diakonian, is to where we get the word deacon from. He is useful to serving, to ministry, to deaconing, right? Notably, all the translations have it because he is helpful to me in my ministry. But actually, Paul leaves it even a little more vague than that. He is helpful to me and let's just keep that Greek word phrase, in deaconing. So is he helpful to Paul in the work of the gospel? Or is he actually even just helpful to Paul in serving Paul? He is helpful to me for the purpose of service, right? Now, I love that vagueness of that. Like, I believe that means service of the gospel on one hand, but also Paul's in trouble. He's struggling with things. It's actually also a service to Paul. And I think that completes this sort of wraparound of almost this apology of sorts from Paul. I'm not saying that this is Paul apologizing, but it closes the loop, doesn't it?
It does.
That not only would I want Mark here because it's good for the gospel, but actually it's good for me. He actually, when everyone has deserted me, he will come and attend to me. The word diakonia, or can mean the act of attending to, of bringing relief, of being commissioned alongside. So it's not simply that, you know what, he abandoned us and I'm willing to let him off the hook. Actually, I previously said he has abandoned us and moved away. Now I'm saying he's actually back doing the very opposite of abandoning. He's being the one that sticks close. It's a beautiful symmetry that if we just allow that word ministry or service to hang around. It's not like Mark left me one day by the side of the road and didn't pick me up and abandoned me, but sure, he's allowed to look after my dog. It's actually the thing that I did, the reason I didn't want him is because he would abandon us. I'm now saying he's going to do the exact opposite. It is overwhelming to think about the restoration, not just of this man's life, but of this relationship, that everything gets put back together. You know?
It's beautiful. And again, there's a lovely throwback potentially in that thought back to the book of Acts. So when we're introduced to John Mark and his role, it says this in Acts 13 verse 5. So this leans into your idea, David, so beautifully. It says, when they arrived at Salamis, this is back in the book of Acts, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. John was with them as their helper. Now, the word that's used there for helper, huperetes, is literally under rower. And it feels like quite a functional role. So it feels like John Mark is there to sort of like serve them, to do a role, a function for Barnabas and Saul. It feels a little bit like, so forgive me if I'm overplaying it, feels a bit like he's working for them.
Yes, definitely.
Whereas the language of Paul in 2 Timothy, no, he's serving not only with me, but as you've leaned into, he's serving me. There's an intimacy. So Acts 13 feels very functional, almost pragmatic, almost matter of fact. All right, he's there to sort of help us, serve us. But by the time you get to 2 Timothy, no, he's grown in stature to the extent that he's with me. He's serving with me. He is part of me. And I think there's a beautiful, again, allusion backwards. I think that's why it's so worthwhile. And we've done this with other stories in text that we've looked at. If you don't read these 9 references to John Mark in isolation, but connect them together, I think in a most amazing way, the Bible, the way it's written, does something with these 9 references that produces a unity in the understanding of this story, which is quite profound. And you're seeing little flashes and reminders of what's been in statements that are made. And I think this is another little allusion there to that idea that he is useful to me in ministry or in serving. And it's absolutely gorgeous. And it's very intimate, very, very tender.
It's interesting even to think about the arc of Paul's life in that, isn't it? That there's a couple of, let me say it like this, you meet Paul in Acts 15 when we see Paul, it's, no, one chance you're out. We're doing this gospel thing, and not only are you out, anyone that supports you is out as well. It's like it's not just that Paul won't take Mark because he abandoned him. He now won't take Barnabas because Barnabas thinks they should take Mark. I mean, it's extreme commitment to a way of thinking that Paul has. Now here at the end, we have actually this closing this loop of Paul's journey. Do we see Paul's maturity in this? I'm thinking in Colossians chapter 4, we've got this letter, and hey, Mark appears to be around with him. And he's like, and he says to the people in Colossae, hey, listen, by the way, if Mark comes your way, welcome him.
Yeah.
Right? Now, a couple of thoughts I have on that. Is it that maybe there's a rumor out there that Mark abandoned Paul, so if Mark comes by, we'll be mean to him? Yep. But also this sense of Paul, you can see Paul beginning to come round that, oh, maybe I got this wrong with Mark. And then there's Paul and Onesimus and Philemon, this story where you've got Paul does the story of John Mark and the influence of Barnabas shape Paul, that in another point in his life, there's a similar situation, and that Paul now goes to bat to defend the person on the margins. Like, there's a lot of kind of spurious but beautiful ideas out there, aren't there?
No. I think they're solid ideas. I absolutely do. If you look at the Colossians reference that you've alluded to within that, even within that reference, Paul talks about Barnabas. So if you read the full reference, it says this. So it says, Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. So there's Paul making a reference to Barnabas. And then it says this, you have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, you've received instructions from who? So I think Paul has sent some instructions, and he sent instructions to the churches he has influence over about him. Now here's the kicker here, David, which is really absolutely gorgeous. So Paul is writing to the church at Colossae. At the same time, I think he's writing to Philemon, who happens to also live in Colossae, and the church there meets in Philemon's house. So two letters sent probably at the same time to the same context. And one is saying about John Mark, you've received instructions, welcome him if he comes. And the other one is a personal letter to Philemon with instructions on how to receive of how to receive Onesimus. Now, the argument I make in the book is if the implied instructions for Mark from Paul in Colossae are anyway reflected in the dynamic detail of the instructions that he sends to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus, then you're catching the spirit of this. And I have no doubt the reference to Barnabas in Colossae is a tip of the hat to Paul, from Paul to Barnabas. And I think even the way that Paul argues on behalf of Onesimus to Philemon, a letter written at the same time that he's representing Mark, is showing that the great apostle has become more tender, more pastoral, and more understanding of the situation. I mean, there's a beautiful symmetry between Onesimus and Mark, in that Paul declares Mark unfit in Acts 15, and in 2 Timothy he declares him. Onesimus is declared as useless, but now as a brother in Christ, he says to Philemon, he has become useful. Same language. I mean that can't be a coincidence. So you've got two letters written at similar times, reflecting similar language about two different people. Yeah. And I think how John Mark is then treated by Paul and how Onesimus is treated by Paul, the two things are connected. And I think there's something going on in Paul that is reflected in his language and treatment of both men.
Yes.
Is that too much of a stretch, or do you think that works?
No. I mean, the connection between the connection between the two letters is well attested amongst scholarship. And I'm just looking at Philemon right now as we're talking, John, and it's quite fascinating when you look at it with that sort of thinking in mind. Just even how it all works. So he calls. Look at Colossians 4 verse 10. Mark sends greetings. If he comes, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. So Aristarchus, Mark, Justus, and then Paul says this about them: these are the only Jews amongst my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have provided a comfort to me. Yes. So Mark's been in, we're hearing this recovery of Mark, but interesting that in his letter, which more than likely accompanies this, to Philemon is also referred to as a co-worker, right? Yes. He also in Philemon refers to how Philemon owes Paul. Like Paul has given Philemon the chance to find Jesus. There's some really interesting little just sort of insights into what's going on here about what can even this synergos language in Greek, this co-worker. Even in Philemon, Mark is referred to as a co-worker.
He is.
So Philemon, you're a co-worker with the gospel. Mark is a co-worker for the gospel. Mark's story, let me write you a story about second chances. Yeah. It's, and even right down to, if Onesimus has wronged you, Philemon, let me repay it. I mean, Barnabas is all over this, isn't he? And this kind of, Paul is playing what he seems to have learned from Barnabas here.
Completely. I mean, I actually make that point in that chapter that I write on Philemon and Colossae. And I make the point that Paul is sounding like Barnabas in this letter. And I think that I can imagine, my holy imagination would say that when Barnabas was arguing for John Mark, he was using this sort of language. He was arguing on behalf of, let this boy, he was unfit, but he is now useful. Let's prove his usefulness. So Paul writes to Philemon, Onesimus was useless, but he is now useful. He's a brother. Receive him as you would a brother. And all of this gorgeous language. And what's really lovely is that you get that sense of change, redemption. Can I say humility of Paul? I think Paul is demonstrating explicitly and implicitly a phenomenal humility here. And anyone who's following his writings can see a humility in Paul, that he's really saying, Barnabas got this right. I believe I made the right decision, but Barnabas did the right thing. And you've got a sense that both men had to make that decision in Acts 15 with so much at stake. Paul is a fiery, zealous go-getter, absolutely uncompromising in his commitment to the gospel. And John Mark probably wasn't the only person he wore out. But by the end of his life, of course, he's got a slightly different perspective. And that may be because of revelation, maybe because of experience, and maybe because he's seen John Mark and others do good when actually maybe others would have written them off, including him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite wonderful, isn't it? And as you were saying it there, John, as well, I was reflecting, perhaps as we round out the conversation of these two bonus episodes about John Mark. Obviously, John Mark, then, tradition holds that he's the writing source of Mark's gospel, and we want to keep that in our mind. It's easy to forget. We're talking about the same person here. The tradition holds, and Mark's gospel doesn't anywhere say, oh, this is John Mark that wrote it. But the early church very quickly seems to ascribe this gospel to him. They say, this is John Mark's gospel. And some people come out and go, well, that's a bit made up. But I'm pretty sold by the argument that if you were going to make up the author of a gospel, John Mark is a very obscure character to pick up and say that it was him, right? So I'm quite happy, and in the same with Luke, and so I'm quite happy with this sort of the traditional connections. I think they're there. And one of the things that the conversation over the last two episodes has made me think about is how much this whole story evidences the sort of self-sacrificial narrative that Mark introduces us to in his gospel. This is Jesus the servant, Jesus the servant king. Yes. We only sort of really, like, all of the Gospels definitely take their particular angle on telling the story. And as you were talking, I couldn't help but just think about Mark 8:34, where Mark has Jesus call the crowd and disciples together. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me in the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose their life? What can anyone give in exchange for their life? There's this, again, I'm just in imaginative space here, John, at the moment. But you've got this character who has abandoned. Barnabas doesn't try and say that's not true. But yes, he did abandon us. That seems to be a matter of factual record. This character abandons the plan and the missionary journeys of these two early apostles. He's given a second chance, but he also now in his teaching of Jesus reminds his readers of the words of Jesus that say, almost say like beware of this journey. Yeah. Don't abandon. Yes, you'll get second chances, but following Jesus is going to look like it's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you something.
Absolutely. And of course, we don't have this in the biblical text, but there's strong tradition to show that Mark literally does lay down his life and dies really somewhat horrific as a follower of Jesus, but literally comes to a place where instead of running, he stands. Mm-hmm. And instead of trying to save his own life, he gives it away. Mm-hmm. And this lovely, lovely story comes to a magnificent conclusion with a martyred shepherd laying down his life for the broken. And I think that is reflected in the language that you've given us there. That he does take his second chance. He uses his second chance. If ever a man demonstrated that a second chance can be a life-changing opportunity, John Mark does it. And I, for one, am deeply grateful.
Yeah, all of us should be, when you think about the implications we've talked about over these last 2 episodes of just how significant this story is. John, I love this conversation. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new series for everyone. But if you miss us in between that time, let me say it. You can buy John's book and do some homework off the back of this. You can buy it. It's available digitally through your website and just searching on any of the kind of big book retailers for Second Chance by John Andrews. You can find that. So I'd encourage you to go and get the book and just enjoy John reflecting on this really fascinating character. So John, thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh, thank you, David. It's been a joy. Bless you all, and may the God of second chances walk with us all.
Thank you for listening to these last 2 bonus episodes about John's new book, Second Chance. Don't forget to pick that up from a bookseller that is available to you. We'll be back in early June with our latest new series of 2 texts. So until then, from us, goodbye.